Welcome to the Curious Case channel, where mysteries unfold and secrets lurk in the shadows. Be sure to subscribe and become part of our thrilling journey into the unknown. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from and what mysteries you'd like us to explore next. Your feedback helps shape the stories we bring to life. The Shadow of Blackwood Manor, Chapter 1, A Whispered Invitation. The autumn wind howled against the windows of Eleanor Greaves' modest yet immaculately kept cottage in Blackthorn Hollow. The scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke filled the air as she sat by the fire, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside her, eyes fixed on the letter that had arrived with the morning post. The paper was thick, expensive, its edges slightly curled as if handled too many times before reaching her. The ink, dark and flowing, bore the unmistakable hand of an old acquaintance, Lady Margaret Blackwood. The note, though polite, carried an undercurrent of urgency, a whisper of something unsaid lurking beneath the pleasantries. Dearest Eleanor, it has been far too long since we last crossed paths, and I sincerely hope this note finds you in good spirits. I write with an invitation, though I confess it is more a request than a mere social call. You may recall Blackwood Manor, our ancestral home. It has seen brighter days, yet my brother insists on hosting a gathering here this Friday evening. A small affair, nothing grand, but I would feel much at ease were you to attend. There will be a few guests of interest: Mr. Alistair Cromwell, my brother's trusted legal advisor, the young and enigmatic Violet Henshaw, and of course the ever-imposing figure of Sebastian Harrow, the playwright whose works often tread the line between brilliance and madness. His assistant, a quiet and unsettling gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Pierce, will also be present. Perhaps it is the loneliness of this old house playing tricks on my nerves, but I cannot shake the feeling that something is amiss. The halls whisper at night, the air grows heavy with secrets unsaid, and then of course there is the matter of the music, but I mustn't alarm you unnecessarily. You always had a sharp mind for such things. Eleanor, tell me, would you do me the kindness of joining us? If only to put my mind at ease. Ever yours, Margaret. Eleanor traced a finger over the ink, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was something in those words, something beyond simple unease. An invitation to a gathering, yes. But more than that, a summons to a mystery waiting to unfold. Eleanor Greaves read the letter a third time, her fingers resting lightly on the crisp parchment, her tea long since gone cold. The words, elegant and carefully measured, carried an unease that had nothing to do with mere pleasantries. Lady Margaret Blackwood was not a woman prone to exaggeration, nor one to let the trivialities of household affairs unsettle her, and yet here she was, all but admitting that something was terribly wrong. The mention of her brother, Alexander Blackwood, was intriguing enough, but it was the reference to his will that sent a slow ripple of unease through Eleanor's mind. The altering of a will was never a casual affair, nor one undertaken without consequence. She had seen enough of human nature to know that few things could stir the deepest, darkest emotions like the prospect of an inheritance slipping through one's grasp. Greed, resentment, long-buried grudges, they all had a way of rising to the surface when wealth and legacy were at stake. And then of course there was the matter of the music. Lady Blackwood had not elaborated, but the mere mention of it, slipped so carefully into the folds of her letter, suggested something more than an old woman's nervous imaginings. Blackwood Manor had always been a place of whispers, an ancestral estate heavy with the weight of its own history, where the walls seemed to breathe with secrets long left unsaid. But music, that was something else entirely. Music was a living thing, a presence in its own right, and if Eleanor had learned anything in her years of quiet observation, it was that sounds, just like words, often carried meaning far beyond what was immediately apparent. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. There was something about this invitation that unsettled her. It was not merely a social gathering, nor even an appeal for companionship. No, this was something else, a summons, a call to something deeper, the kind of thing one did not refuse. Eleanor let out a slow breath, then folded the letter neatly and set it aside. It seemed, whether she wished it or not, that she was bound for Blackwood Manor, and whatever waited for her there, she had the distinct impression that it would be nothing so simple as an evening of idle conversation. A will. It was the kind of matter that had a way of unraveling even the most carefully constructed facades, the sort of situation that often ended not with quiet resolutions, but with tragedy. Eleanor Greaves folded the letter with deliberate precision, her mind already sifting through the implications of Lady Blackwood's words. There was more here than mere unease. There was a silent alarm woven into the ink, a plea disguised as polite invitation. With a small knowing nod, she slipped the letter into the drawer of her writing desk. She would of course accept. The journey to Blackwood Manor was not long, but it gave Eleanor ample time to consider what awaited her. The guests, she imagined, were not chosen for their compatibility, but rather for their proximity to the heart of the storm. Alistair Cromwell, the ever-loyal solicitor, would no doubt spend the evening speaking in careful half-truths, treading the fine line between professional discretion and personal entanglement. Young Violet Henshaw, with her enigmatic charm and inheritance at stake, would surely have her own thoughts on Alexander Blackwood's sudden inclination to alter his will. And then there was Sebastian Harrow, the playwright, brilliant, volatile, a man whose words had built entire worlds and ruined just as many reputations. It was an interesting mix, but not half as interesting as the last name on the list, Nathaniel Pierce, a secretary, a quiet observer, a man who had unsettled even the composed Lady Blackwood. That, more than anything, piqued Eleanor's curiosity. Secretaries knew more than anyone else in a household. They were the silent custodians of secrets, handling letters, finances, whispered conversations behind closed doors. And as Eleanor had learned long ago, those who were accustomed to being overlooked often made the most dangerous of adversaries. As the carriage rumbled up the long tree-lined drive of Blackwood Manor, she let out a slow breath. It was, she thought with a wry amusement, the perfect setting for murder. The manor loomed before her, a vast shadow against the twilight sky, its grand Georgian windows glowing with deceptive warmth. The butler, a man with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen everything yet spoken of nothing, greeted her with a curt nod, and led her inside. The drawing-room was already filled with quiet murmurs and measured glances. Lady Blackwood, elegant as ever, but with a tension in her posture that had not been there before, greeted Eleanor with obvious relief. "Eleanor, my dear, I cannot tell you how glad I am that you could come." From across the room, a figure stirred. Alexander Blackwood himself, a man of lean frame and sharp calculating eyes, observed her from his seat near the fireplace. His fingers drummed idly against the armrest, a habit of impatience, of control. He did not stand, nor did he extend the usual pleasantries. Instead, his gaze settled on her with quiet appraisal. "Miss Greaves, is it?" His voice was smooth, but there was something in it, something edged. "Margaret speaks highly of you. I assume you are not entirely a stranger to music." Eleanor allowed a small polite smile. "I have a great fondness for it," she said, though already she was wondering what kind of music it was that played in the halls of Blackwood Manor, and more importantly, what it might be trying to say. Eleanor Greaves smiled, her expression carefully composed, though a flicker of intrigue sparked in her mind. Sir Alexander Blackwood's remark had been casual, almost flippant, but was it merely a comment, or was it something more? A warning perhaps, an invitation into the shadows that lurked behind the grandeur of Blackwood Manor. She had encountered such men before, powerful, confident, men who expected the world to bend to their will, and she had learned over time that those who commanded silence often feared what might be heard. The gathering of suspects' dinner at Blackwood Manor was an affair of measured elegance, the sort that masked more than it revealed. The grand dining hall, illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight, cast long shadows against the panelled walls, the flickering flames barely dispelling the chill that lingered in the air. Conversation was polite, practiced, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the room, thick as the scent of aged wine and wax-polished wood. Eleanor sat to the right of Lady Margaret Blackwood, her poised hostess, whose every word seemed carefully weighed before it was spoken. Years of aristocratic decorum had trained her well, but there was a tightness in her smile, a stiffness in her posture that betrayed the unease beneath. Eleanor had spent a lifetime observing such subtleties, and tonight there was no shortage of things to notice. At the head of the table, Alexander Blackwood presided over his guests, like a monarch surveying his court. Though age had silvered his hair, his presence remained as formidable as ever, his sharp eyes watching, calculating, measuring. He spoke little, yet his silence carried more weight than the idle chatter of those around him. His fingers drummed absently against the mahogany table, a slow, rhythmic pattern, as though keeping time to a melody only he could hear. To his left sat his wife, a woman of striking beauty, whose once soft features had been sculpted into something colder, harder. Helena Blackwood's movements were precise, her knife and fork cutting through the delicately prepared meal with the same restraint she seemed to apply to her words. She rarely met her husband's gaze, and when she did, it was with the look of someone who had long learned the futility of speaking against him. At the far end of the table, Violet Henshaw, the young and clever ward of the Blackwoods, maintained a composed facade, though her sharp blue eyes betrayed the restless mind beneath. There was something about her, Eleanor noted, a watchfulness, a quiet rebellion that simmered just beneath the surface. Was it merely the frustration of youth, or was there something more? Across from her sat Alistair Cromwell, the ever-dutiful solicitor. His thin fingers rested near his untouched glass of wine, his expression unreadable. But Eleanor knew his kind well, men who dealt in words, in legacies, in the delicate balance of power that came with handling another man's fortune. And if he had spent years managing Blackwood's affairs, he had no doubt learned when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. And then there was Nathaniel Pierce, the secretary, a man who, by all accounts, should have blended into the background, and yet Eleanor had learned long ago that those who were meant to be invisible often saw the most. He was quiet, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his stillness, something unnerving. Even Lady Blackwood, composed as she was, had written of the unease he inspired in her. A conversation murmured on, knives scraped against porcelain, and yet the tension in the room did not ease. It thickened, coiling in the corners like smoke from an unseen fire. Something was coming. Eleanor could feel it in the air, that unspoken anticipation before a storm. And then, quite suddenly, Alexander Blackwood set down his wineglass with a sharp clink and spoke. "Let us dispense with pleasantries," he said, his voice even but edged with something dangerous. "There is something we must discuss tonight." A pause, a held breath. Eleanor tilted her head ever so slightly, listening. The stage was set, the performance was about to begin, and she had no doubt that before the night was over, someone at this very table would not leave Blackwood Manor alive. The last time Eleanor Greaves had seen Vincent Hale, he had been a young man with music in his fingers and fire in his soul. That fire had since dimmed into something colder, something darker. Age had not softened him, instead it had chiseled his once boyish features into something sharp, almost cruel. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he still played to an invisible audience, still desperate for the applause that had long since faded. And then there were his eyes, watchful, calculating, filled with a bitterness that had settled into his bones like a forgotten melody. Seated across from Hale was Mr. Rupert Alden, Blackwood's solicitor, a man who had spent his life handling the legal affairs of the powerful, but who now seemed deeply uncomfortable in his role. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his napkin, his gaze darting to Alexander Blackwood every time the conversation veered too close to the subject of inheritance. He smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly at comments that were not meant to be humorous. A man who knew something, a man who feared something. And then there was Oliver Finch, the secretary, quiet, almost invisible, the kind of man one might overlook in a crowded room, and yet Eleanor had long since learned to pay special attention to such people. His presence was subdued, his words sparse, but his gaze saw everything. When Blackwood spoke, Finch listened with an intensity that did not match his otherwise meek demeanor. He was a man who had spent years in the background, unnoticed, and yet in that silence, in that stillness, there was power. Eleanor observed it all as the dinner progressed, speaking little but absorbing everything. Human nature was a puzzle, and she had spent her life learning how to fit the pieces together. It was in the way a man held his fork, the way a woman hesitated before answering a question, the way silence settled after a certain name was spoken. And tonight, there were far too many unspoken words hanging in the air, far too many glances that held meaning left unsaid. And then it happened. A single moment, a shift in the room. Alexander Blackwood set his wineglass down with a deliberate clink. The sound cut through the murmured conversation like a knife. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily through the grand dining hall, "let's not waste any more time." A pause, a breath held too long. "I have made a decision about the future of Blackwood Manor." Eleanor did not move, did not blink. She simply watched, because she already knew, before the night was over, someone in this room would not live to see the morning. The moment Alexander Blackwood set his glass down, the room seemed to shrink. The fire crackled in the grand hearth, but the warmth did not reach the faces around the table. He did not raise his voice, and yet his words cut through the air like a blade. "It seems pointless to avoid the subject any longer," he said, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood of the dining table. "I intend to finalize my new will within the next week." A silence followed, thick and unnatural, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Mr. Alden, the solicitor, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Lady Blackwood's fork scraped too harshly against her plate, the sharp sound making Eleanor Greaves glance up. Henry Blackwood, the heir, or at least, the man who had assumed himself to be, stiffened, his expression darkening as his grip on the silverware tightened. "I see," Henry said at last, his voice forced into politeness. "And might we know what these changes entail?" A slow, deliberate smile curled across Blackwood's lips. It held no mirth, only something colder, something calculating. "That, my dear boy, is my business." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Across the table, Vincent Hale let out a low chuckle, a sound that did not belong in a room this tense. "And you, Hale," Blackwood continued, his piercing gaze shifting to the pianist. "No cutting remarks tonight." Vincent's fingers tapped lightly against his wineglass, but his smile did not reach his eyes. "Oh, I learned long ago, Blackwood, that some battles aren't worth fighting. You've had your victories. Let's leave it at that." Blackwood smirked, lifting his glass as though in a silent toast, a gracious sentiment, if uncharacteristic. Eleanor watched as Vincent's fingers curled, ever so slightly, around the stem of his glass. Whatever history existed between the two men, it was far from resolved. The conversation carried on, but the atmosphere had changed. The polite veneer of civility was cracking, revealing the raw tension beneath. By the time the final course had been cleared away, Blackwood folded his napkin and rose from his chair. "I believe I shall retire to the music room," he announced, smoothing a hand over his waistcoat. "I find a good nocturne to be the perfect end to an evening." Across the table, Lady Blackwood exhaled, a sigh too controlled to be relief, too measured to be anything but weary resignation. Eleanor noticed everything, the clenched fists, the averted gazes, the words left unspoken, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that before the night was over, one of these people would ensure that Alexander Blackwood never played another note again. As Vincent Hale leaned back in his chair, he offered a thin-lipped smile, the ghost of something unreadable flickering across his face. "Still keeping to old habits, I see," he mused, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "You always did have an odd fondness for that nocturne of yours." Alexander Blackwood's gaze was cold, unforgiving. "Some things," he said, voice low and final, "are timeless." Eleanor Greaves watched as he strode from the room, his movements sharp, controlled, deliberate, as always. It was only after the heavy doors closed behind him that the air in the dining hall seemed to shift. Lady Blackwood exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. Henry, still seething, poured himself another glass of wine, the irritation on his face melting into something far more unreadable. Hale drummed his fingers idly against the table, lost in thought, his usual smirk absent. Meanwhile, Alden, the solicitor, let out a breath of quiet relief, and finally allowed himself to drain his brandy. And Eleanor, she simply watched, because she could feel it, that unseen force in the air, a tension, subtle but unmistakable, a shadow, lingering just beyond reach, something brewing beneath the surface, waiting, calculating, unseen but inevitable. Then from somewhere deep within the grand halls of Blackwood Manor, the first notes of music began to drift through the corridors. A nocturne. Blackwood's nocturne. The delicate melody threaded its way under doors, through the dimly lit corridors, curling around the edges of the evening like a whisper in the dark. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played with immaculate precision, flawless, unshaken. And yet, it was empty. Blackwood had always been known for his skill at the piano, his hands as disciplined as his mind, but there was no warmth in his playing, no soul, only cold, sharp technique. The conversation around the table faded as the music filled the silence. The guests listened, each lost in their own thoughts, in their own secrets, and then the music stopped, abruptly. One note hung in the air, suspended in time, then nothing. A silence heavier than before crept into the room, settling over them like a thick fog. Eleanor's gaze flickered toward the closed doors. The music had not ended. It had been cut short. Across the table, Lady Blackwood's knuckles had gone white against the linen of her napkin. Henry sat frozen, wineglass halfway to his lips. Vincent Hale had stopped tapping his fingers, and Eleanor knew, somewhere in the vast echoing halls of Blackwood Manor, death had finally arrived. The music wove through the halls of Blackwood Manor, a haunting presence that wrapped around the guests like an unseen hand. Alexander Blackwood had always been meticulous, his talent at the piano undeniable, flawless even, but his playing had never been about passion. Even in music he was a strategist, each note placed with precision, devoid of warmth. In the drawing room, the guests remained, lingering in a silence disguised as idle conversation. Eleanor Greaves sat composed, her hands steady as she knitted, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. Across from her, Henry Blackwood lounged in his chair, his expression unreadable, his fingers drumming against the armrest with a steady, controlled rhythm. Vincent Hale stood near the window, arms crossed, his brow furrowed in something between irritation and unease. Lady Blackwood's posture was statuesque, though her knuckles whitened against the arms of her chair. Alden Finch, the solicitor, checked his watch once. Then again, his discomfort was palpable, his glances toward the door betraying a desire to leave, and still, the nocturne played on. The music continued its steady, deliberate course through the house, until it stopped, not at the expected resolution, not with the soft, lingering fade of the final note. No, this was different. The melody was cut short, severed mid-measure, leaving behind an emptiness so jarring it seemed to vibrate in the walls. For a single heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, a scream, sharp, terrified, splitting the silence apart. Every guest froze. Lady Blackwood's breath hitched as she rose too quickly from her chair, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Henry's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his glass slipping from his fingers, shattering against the polished wood. Hale turned sharply toward the door, his face unreadable, while Finch stumbled backward, his throat working as if swallowing words he dared not say. The sound had come from the hall, from the music room. The guests hesitated only for a second before movement erupted all at once. Eleanor was the last to rise, setting her knitting down with deliberate care, because she already knew. She had seen it in their faces, in their carefully veiled expressions, in the tension that had rippled beneath the surface all evening. Someone in this house had been waiting for the music to stop, and now, it finally had. Bernard Hale moved first, striding toward the hallway with a sense of urgency that sent a ripple of unease through the remaining guests. His usual air of detached amusement had vanished, replaced with something far more serious. Miss Eleanor Greaves, ever composed, set her knitting aside with deliberate care before rising to follow. The others hesitated only briefly before moving as one, drawn toward the sound that had shattered the uneasy calm of the evening. The music room lay at the end of the corridor, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light cut through the darkness, spilling onto the polished floor like a beacon. As they approached, an eerie stillness settled over them, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Oliver Graves, the secretary, stood frozen in the doorway, his usually impassive face drained of all color. His mouth moved soundlessly, his fingers twitching at his sides, but no words came. Beyond him, the scene was unmistakable. Sir Alexander Blackwood sat at the grand piano, slumped forward, his lifeless fingers resting against the keys. The final note he had played still seemed to linger in the air, an unfinished echo of what once was. His head lay at an unnatural angle, his forehead pressed against the polished wood, as if bowing in defeat. The sheet music before him was torn at the corner, the crumpled edge betraying a desperate grasp, perhaps his last. A single candle flickered in the room's dim glow, casting long shifting shadows that danced across the velvet curtains and mahogany furnishings. And then an even more unsettling detail emerged. The grand clock in the hall had stopped, the time precisely 1 a.m. A long silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of realization. It was Mr. Alden Finch, the solicitor, who finally found his voice, though it was hoarse and uncertain. "A heart attack," he murmured, almost to himself, as if trying to will the explanation into truth. Bernard Hale let out a short, humorless laugh. He stepped closer, his gaze sharp, scrutinizing the scene with a pianist's trained eye. "Convenient, isn't it?" Miss Greaves said nothing, but as she took in the small, seemingly insignificant details, the torn music sheet, the slight shift in the stool's position, the faintest scent of something sharp in the air, her mind was already working, unraveling the threads of a performance far more intricate than any nocturne Sir Alexander had ever played. Someone had been waiting for the music to stop, and now it finally had. Henry Ashworth took a slow step forward, his face unreadable, his eyes locked onto the lifeless figure at the piano. A long silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards as the others inched closer, their breaths held, their minds refusing to grasp what their eyes were seeing. Miss Eleanor Greaves moved without hesitation, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene with a precision honed over years of observation. She had seen death before, many times, in many forms, and while she was no physician, she knew instinctively when something was wrong. This was not the peaceful passing of an old man at his beloved piano. There was something too controlled about the way Sir Alexander Blackwood remained upright, his fingers poised against the keys as if in mid-performance. A man struck down by fate did not fall so elegantly. No, this was deliberate. Her eyes darted over the details others might have missed, the slightly crumpled corner of the sheet music, as though clutched in a final moment of struggle, the stopped clock, its silent hands frozen at the precise moment of death, and his face, his face, not peaceful, not merely surprised. There was something in his expression, a ghost of realization, of horror, a moment of knowing. Something dark settled in Miss Greaves' chest. This was not a death, this was a performance, and somewhere in this house, the murderer was waiting for the applause. A sharp intake of breath from the doorway drew her attention. Oliver Graves, the secretary, had finally found his voice, though it trembled on the edges of fear. "I only came to bring him his tea," he stammered, motioning toward a silver tray on the side table, the cup untouched, its surface smooth and undisturbed. "I knocked but he didn't answer." The words hung in the air like a final note left unresolved. Miss Greaves glanced back at the body, at the slight tension still clinging to the lifeless fingers, at the silent, stopped clock, at the untouched tea. Someone had been here before Oliver Graves. Someone had waited, watched and listened, as the final notes of the nocturne played. Someone had made sure the music ended, permanently, and that someone was still here. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with an unspoken horror that none dared put into words. The music had stopped, and so had Sir Alexander Blackwood's life. But why? How? Oliver Graves' voice was barely above a whisper, strained and trembling. I thought maybe he had just finished playing, but when I knocked, he didn't answer." He swallowed hard. The silence felt wrong. His voice faltered, his face pale as death itself. Henry Ashworth exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "We need to call the police." Bernard Hale, still staring at the lifeless figure, muttered, "Yes, let them sort out this mess." But there was something unreadable in his tone, resignation perhaps, or something darker. Eleanor Greaves, however, was already working through the puzzle in her mind. The torn sheet music. Why had Sir Alexander gripped it so desperately? The stopped clock. Was that coincidence, or had someone marked the precise moment of death? And above all, the expression on his face, shock, not pain. Why had his final moment been one of realization rather than struggle? There was a pattern in the chaos, a thread waiting to be pulled, and she intended to unravel it. The marks of murder Inspector Jonathan Drake arrived at Blackwood Manor with the weariness of a man who had seen too many deaths, yet still carried the quiet expectation that each case had the power to surprise him. His sharp gaze swept over the gathered guests, cataloguing expressions, noting every nervous glance, every clenched jaw. Without a word, he strode into the music room, where Sir Alexander's body remained seated at the grand piano. The dim candlelight cast long shadows, turning the elegant space into something far more sinister. Eleanor Greaves watched the inspector closely. She respected him, his thoroughness, his patience, his ability to notice the details others ignored, and most importantly, he never dismissed an unusual line of thought. Drake stepped forward, his gloved hands resting on the back of a chair as he took in the scene. His keen eyes flickered over the body, and within seconds, he saw what Eleanor had already noted: the unnatural stillness, the deliberate positioning. This was not a man who had simply died in the middle of his music. This was a message, one neither of them intended to ignore. A thick silence hung in the air, as though the very walls of Ashworth Manor had absorbed the weight of the moment. The flickering candlelight cast restless shadows over the music room, the stillness disturbed only by the ragged breathing of those gathered at the doorway. Sir Reginald Ashworth remained seated at the grand piano, his posture eerily composed. His fingers, long and elegant even in death, rested lightly upon the ivory keys, as if he had been caught mid-performance. His head drooped forward slightly, his forehead nearly touching the polished surface of the instrument. Inspector Craddock took a slow step forward, his boots echoing ominously against the wooden floor. He had seen death in many forms, but this was too perfect, too staged. No man suffering a heart attack or a sudden seizure would remain so carefully poised. Death was rarely so neat. He frowned, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene, searching for the inconsistencies his instincts told him were there. Then he saw it. Dark bruises, faint but unmistakable, they were forming in sickly patterns around the pale skin of Sir Reginald's throat. The shape was distinct, fingertips pressing into flesh, the telltale sign of force, of struggle, of murder. Craddock's expression darkened as he turned sharply to his sergeant. "Send for Dr. Whitaker immediately," he ordered, his voice clipped, decisive. "But I'll tell you now, this wasn't natural causes." He looked back at the lifeless form before him, his jaw tightening. This man was strangled. A collective gasp rippled through the doorway. The guests, who had been watching in tense silence, now reacted in a flurry of emotion. Lady Ashworth clutched at the pearl necklace around her throat, her knuckles whitening. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, took an unsteady step backward, his eyes darting about the room as though searching for an escape. Henry Ashworth exhaled sharply, but his face was unreadable, calm, too calm. But Bernard Hale, standing rigid by the window, let out a slow breath, and muttered something under his breath. But Miss Eleanor Marple, seated a few feet away in a high-backed chair, remained still. She merely pursed her lips. The moment she had stepped into this room, she had known something was wrong. Sir Reginald's expression, frozen in death, had not been one of peace nor pain, but of something far more troubling: shock. He had seen something in his final moments, something that had filled him with a terror so deep that it lingered even in death. The details were beginning to form in her mind, like scattered puzzle pieces waiting to be arranged. The torn sheet music, as if yanked in a final desperate grasp, the stopped clock, marking the exact moment of death, the untouched teacup on the silver tray, the slight tension still present in his hands, suggesting he had not gone limp immediately. No, this had not been a crime of passion. This had been planned, calculated, and most chillingly, committed in silence, so that no one beyond these walls would hear. She shifted her gaze to the gathered faces before her. Somewhere among them, a murderer stood, feigning their shock, masking their relief, and Miss Marple intended to find them. It was as she had suspected. Inspector Craddock straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room as he absorbed the weight of what he had just confirmed. "Strangled," he murmured, almost to himself, his voice carrying the edge of a man accustomed to seeing the worst in people. And yet, no sign of a struggle. How very odd. He turned sharply to the assembled household, his eyes flicking between each face with the sharpness of a blade. There was tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the walls of Ashworth Manor themselves were closing in. Each guest sat at varying distances from one another, scattered across the drawing room like pieces on a chessboard, each playing their role in an unseen game. Lady Ashworth sat near the fireplace, its glow casting flickering shadows across her porcelain features. She was poised rigid, her spine straight, her hands clasped in her lap with the precision of someone who had long mastered the art of composure. And yet, there was something else beneath her carefully curated exterior, not grief, not sorrow, but something closer to resignation. Craddock wasted no time. "Tell me about your husband." The question hung in the air for a beat, and then with neither hesitation nor embellishment, she answered, "I despised him." A ripple of shock moved through the room, the murmurs of disbelief barely concealed. The very notion that a widow could speak so plainly of the man she had just lost was scandalous. But Miss Marple, seated quietly at the far end of the room, noted the way Henry Ashworth merely folded his arms across his chest. He was not surprised. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice sharp as a blade, cutting through the tension. "Reginald was a cruel man. He enjoyed control over me, over this house, over everyone he encountered. He ruled with a cold, calculated hand, and he relished it." She exhaled slowly, her expression never wavering. "I remained because society expected it of me. But if you believe I am in mourning, Inspector, you are gravely mistaken." Craddock studied her, his keen detective's instincts scrutinizing every word, every flicker of movement, every subtle tension in her jaw. "And where were you at the time of his death?" "In this very room. You may ask anyone here." And so he did. He turned his attention to Henry Ashworth, who had thus far remained impassive. The flickering firelight cast harsh lines across his face, accentuating the shadows beneath his eyes. "And you?" Craddock asked. "Where were you?" Henry exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Here, with them." He gestured vaguely to the others. "I have nothing to hide. I make no pretense of grief, but I did not kill him." His voice was measured, but Miss Marple noted how his fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of his sleeve, a small unconscious gesture of unease. Bernard Hale was next. He had remained near the window, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. When addressed, he let out a slow breath before speaking. "Reginald was not a man who inspired fondness," he admitted, "but murder, that's something else entirely." His fingers drummed idly against his arm. "I was here, as was everyone else. The music was playing, and then," he hesitated, his brow furrowing. Then it stopped, abruptly. That was the first sign that something was wrong. Craddock nodded, turning his attention to Mr. Weston, the solicitor, who had been eyeing the door as though contemplating an escape. "Mr. Weston," the man cleared his throat. I was here, as well." The clock struck 1, and not long after, the music ceased. Then the scream. He swallowed, his gaze flicking toward the doorway as if expecting to see something lurking beyond it. And we all know what happened next. Miss Marple listened in silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The words, the expressions, the barely concealed tensions, each was another thread in the web of deception that had been spun within these walls. Somewhere among them, the truth was waiting to be unraveled. Craddock's expression remained unreadable as he turned back to the room. "Very well," he said. "No one left this room during the time of death, and yet Sir Reginald Ashworth was strangled, his body carefully positioned, and the clock was stopped at the exact moment of his death." His voice dropped slightly, his next words sending a shiver through the room. "Which means the killer was not outside that music room, but inside it." A heavy silence fell, the realization sinking into the assembled guests like a slow-moving poison. Miss Marple pursed her lips, her sharp gaze flickering with knowing calculation. She had seen enough, heard enough. The pieces were all there. Now it was only a matter of putting them together. The alibi held, but holding was not the same as clearing, and Lady Ashworth's unwavering composure did little to remove the shadow of suspicion that lingered over her. Inspector Craddock took a measured breath, his eyes narrowing as he turned his attention to the next person in line. Henry Ashworth. The young man stiffened at the mention of his name. His fingers, which had been drumming anxiously against the armrest of his chair, stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their restless tapping. His agitation was palpable, betrayed by the tension in his jaw, the way his foot tapped soundlessly against the floor, and the flickering glances he kept throwing toward the others in the room. "I won't pretend I got along with my uncle," he admitted at last, his voice edged with something between defiance and unease. "But I certainly didn't kill him." Craddock studied him, his keen gaze dissecting every movement, every hesitation. "Did you know he was changing his will?" Henry's reaction was subtle, but telling. A flicker of something, anger, fear, resentment, crossed his face before he composed himself. He hesitated for half a beat too long before answering. "Yes," he said finally, his tone guarded. "I found out earlier this evening." Craddock did not blink. "And you weren't happy about it." There it was again, that tension, the way his fingers curled slightly into the fabric of his sleeve, the way his shoulders tensed as though bracing for a blow. Henry let out a sharp breath, irritation creeping into his tone. "Would you be?" he shot back. "I've been expecting that inheritance my entire life. My whole future was planned around it. And now suddenly he decides to change everything." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Of course I was furious. Anyone would be." He stopped himself abruptly, jaw tightening as he realized the implications of his own words. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his dark hair. "But that doesn't mean I—" He broke off again, pressing his lips together in frustration. "Look, I didn't kill him." Craddock let the silence stretch between them for a moment, letting Henry's own words weigh against him. Then, without another word, he shifted his attention to the next figure in the room, Mr. Weston, the solicitor. If Henry had been restless, Weston was something else entirely, sweating, shifting in his seat, his fingers twitching against his cuffs as though adjusting them would somehow protect him from scrutiny. He looked in every way like a man who wanted to be anywhere else but here. Craddock leaned in ever so slightly. "You don't look particularly comfortable, Mr. Weston." The solicitor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't see what you mean." Craddock's voice remained calm, measured. "Let's make this simple. Was Sir Reginald planning to revise his will?" Weston hesitated. His eyes darted toward the door, as though calculating whether he could make a swift exit. But there was no escaping this. Not now. "Yes," he admitted at last, his voice thin and strained. "He was." Craddock nodded slowly. "And had this revised will been finalized?" Weston's throat worked again, as he swallowed. "Ho," he confessed. The final version had not yet been signed. That statement landed like a weight in the room. Unspoken implications hung in the air, thick as smoke. An unsigned will. A powerful man dead before he could make it official. Craddock narrowed his eyes. And who exactly stood to benefit from these changes? Weston paled, his hands fidgeted with the edge of his cuff again, his nervous energy betraying him. "I am not at liberty to discuss such matters," he muttered. A slow, knowing smile crept onto Craddock's face as he leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sir, your client is dead." The words sent a ripple through the room. The air itself seemed to tighten around them. Henry clenched his fists. Lady Ashworth remained motionless, her face unreadable. Bernard Hale shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze dropping to the fire as though contemplating something deeper. Weston let out a shuddering breath, his lips parting as though about to speak. And then the grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour. The chime rang out through the silence, hollow and eerie, a cruel reminder that time had not stopped moving, even if for some it had run out completely. Miss Marple, silent until now, merely pressed her hands together, her eyes sharp with quiet calculation. She had already begun to see the shape of the truth forming within the tangled web of lies, and soon, very soon, the murderer would have nowhere left to hide. The room held its breath. For a moment no one spoke, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating mist. "His secretary," Craddock repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. Weston, clearly miserable, nodded. "Yes, Oliver Graves was to be the new primary beneficiary." A stunned silence followed. All eyes turned to Graves. Unlike the others, who had displayed varying degrees of shock, denial, or nervous energy, Oliver Graves sat perfectly still. There was no visible reaction, no sharp intake of breath, no telltale twitch of surprise. His expression remained unreadable, calm, controlled, almost disturbingly so. From across the room, Bernard Hale let out a low, amused chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, folding his long fingers together, his mouth curling into something resembling a smirk. "Well, well, well," he murmured, his voice tinged with something close to admiration. He turned his gaze toward Graves, his eyes glinting with interest. What an interesting turn of events. Inspector Craddock, unimpressed by Hale's theatrics, shifted his attention to him. "And you, sir," he said coolly. "You and Sir Reginald had a history, I understand." Hale arched an eyebrow. "Indeed," he admitted, stretching his fingers idly. "We were rivals once. He won competitions I should have won. He received praise I should have received. And of course he enjoyed lording it over me whenever he could." Craddock's eyes didn't waver. "And you resented him for it?" "Oh, very much," Hale said lightly. Then almost lazily, he let out a soft chuckle. "But I didn't need to kill him for revenge, Inspector. You see, time already did that for me. He was a bitter old man clinging to past glories. What satisfaction would I gain from his death now?" His words were casual, but there was something in his tone, a quiet triumph perhaps, or maybe just the smug certainty of a man who had already won in his own way. Craddock made a note, but his attention had already shifted. The true mystery of the evening sat before him, perfectly composed. "Mr. Graves," he said, turning back to the secretary. Graves inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, waiting. "You were about to inherit a great deal of money," Craddock stated. Graves blinked, his expression unchanging. "I had no idea." Craddock's lips pressed into a thin line. "You expect us to believe that?" Graves met his gaze with a quiet steadiness. "I do not expect anything, Inspector. I only deal in facts, and the fact is, I did not kill Sir Reginald." Craddock studied him for a long, tense moment. There was something about Graves that made him difficult to read. His face revealed nothing, his posture remained impeccable, and his responses were measured with almost mechanical precision. "Where were you at the time of death?" "In my room," Graves said simply. "Alone?" "Yes." Craddock exhaled through his nose, a flimsy alibi, and yet, Miss Marple, who had been watching from her chair, tilted her head slightly. There was something about Oliver Graves, not in what he said, but in how he said it. She had met men like him before, men who understood the power of silence, who knew exactly how much to reveal, and how much to hold back. He was not an ordinary suspect, he was something else. As the questioning ended, Craddock straightened and addressed the room. "Sir Reginald Ashworth was murdered," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Of that I have no doubt. And one of you knows more than you are saying." A heavy silence settled over the guests, thick and oppressive. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her mind already knitting the threads of the case together. It was not just about the will, it was not just about past grudges, it was something more, and she intended to find out what. A note of suspicion. The drawing room at Ashworth Manor had grown cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Tension had settled over the guests like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Each person had withdrawn into their own thoughts, calculating, remembering, perhaps even regretting. The silence was not just silence, it was 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 unspoken fears. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle waiting. While Inspector Craddock continued his questioning, she slipped away, unnoticed, back to the music room. The chamber was dimly lit, the great piano looming in the half-darkness, like a silent sentinel. A single candelabra flickered, its light casting long, shifting shadows across the polished ebony surface. The air was thick with the faint scent of wax, old wood, and something else, something metallic, blood. She moved carefully, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room, taking in details others had overlooked. The torn sheet music, the clock, stopped at the moment of death, the meticulous order of the room, disturbed only in the places where Sir Reginald had last moved. Her gloved fingers brushed lightly against the piano keys. The silence of the instrument was almost unnatural, as if it too had been shocked into stillness by the murder. Miss Marple had seen many deaths in her lifetime, but this one had a particular note to it, a note of something deeper, a note of suspicion. The grand clock stood frozen at exactly 10 p.m., its hands caught in time like a silent witness to the crime. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it only briefly before shifting back to the piano. There was something about it, something that had been tugging at the edges of her mind since the moment she first laid eyes on it. She had been seated near it earlier that evening, her gloved hands resting lightly upon its polished surface, and in that moment she had felt it, a fleeting sensation, a tiny sting, barely perceptible, like the briefest brush of a needle against her skin. Had she imagined it? Stepping forward now, she ran her lace-gloved fingers delicately over the keys, her touch feather-light. Then with practiced ease, she played the opening notes of Nocturne in E-flat major, the very piece Sir Reginald had been performing when he met his untimely end. As the melody unfolded, she felt it again, a prick, a sharp, almost imperceptible sting beneath her fingertip. She paused, her sharp blue eyes narrowing, then pressing the key once more, but this time with greater force. She felt it distinctly, a piercing sting, quick as a whisper. She withdrew her hand at once, her mind racing. Something was hidden within the piano. With careful precision, Miss Marple removed her gloves and leaned in for a closer look. The polished wood and ivory revealed no immediate secrets, no obvious tampering, and yet as she let her fingertips drift once more across the keys, she detected it, something almost invisible to the naked eye, a nearly imperceptible gap between the ivory of one particular key and its base. Reaching into her knitting bag, she produced a long, slender hatpin and carefully inserted it into the tiny gap. Applying just the slightest pressure, she waited. There was a faint click, something inside the key shifted, and for the briefest moment, a sliver of metal no longer than the tip of a sewing needle emerged from the surface, before retracting just as swiftly. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her expression one of deep satisfaction. "Quite ingenious," she murmured, her eyes twinkling with grim admiration. "A hidden trap, designed to pierce the skin only when a particular key was pressed with enough force, and if her suspicions were correct, the tiny needle had been coated with something lethal." The implications were chilling. Sir Reginald had died at his piano, his body slumped naturally over the keys, his death appearing peaceful, almost poetic, but he had not been strangled. No, he had been poisoned, and not by a drink, or a meal, or an injection in the dead of night. He had been killed by the very instrument he cherished. Miss Marple straightened, her mind working swiftly through the puzzle. Someone had known Sir Reginald's habits intimately. Someone had counted on the fact that he played the same nocturne every evening, striking the same keys with precise, practiced familiarity. And someone had prepared a fatal trap. No confrontation, no struggle, no overt act of violence, just a single touch, a brush of fingertips against ivory. A quiet, deadly certainty, but Miss Marple needed proof. A quick test was required. Retrieving a clean handkerchief from her bag, she used the tip of the hatpin to press the fabric gently against the needle's point. Then carefully, she held the cloth near the flickering candlelight. She waited. Within moments, a dark stain began to bloom across the delicate fabric, a telltale reaction, known only to those well-versed in the nature of certain poisons. Miss Marple nodded to herself, lips pressed in quiet satisfaction. Yes, the killer had been clever, but not clever enough. The motive revealed the poisoned needle had confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. Sir Reginald Ashworth's murder was not an impulsive crime. It was not the result of a heated argument, or a moment of unchecked rage. No, this was the work of patience, precision, calculation. Someone had known Sir Reginald's routines intimately. They had counted on his rigid habits, the unwavering consistency with which he sat at his beloved piano, playing the same piece every evening at precisely the same hour. They had engineered a trap so subtle, so insidiously clever, that death itself had arrived in silence, slipping through the grand halls of Ashworth Manor like a ghost. This was not greed. This was not simple jealousy. This was something deeper, something colder. This was revenge. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly, her expression serene. But her mind, oh her mind was anything but idle. She had watched them all, the grieving widow, the disinherited nephew, the resentful rival, the anxious solicitor, and the composed secretary. Each had a motive, each had something to gain, but only one had the patience to wait, only one had the knowledge to construct such an elegant execution. Only one had looked at Sir Reginald, not with hatred in the heat of the moment, but with the quiet simmering loathing that could survive for years, and that was Oliver Graves. He had been utterly calm throughout the investigation, not fidgeting like Henry, not restless like Weston. He had not displayed the thinly veiled resentment of Bernard Hale, nor the defensive anger of Lady Ashworth. He had stood apart, silent, observing, not guilty, not afraid, just waiting. That was what unnerved Miss Marple the most. She had spent a lifetime watching people, unraveling the intricate webs of their emotions, and she recognized that look, the look of a man who had already made peace with his actions, a man who had waited long enough. That night, Miss Marple spoke quietly with Inspector Craik. The police had already begun their inquiries, combing through statements, searching for inconsistencies, but Miss Marple, with her uncanny ability to see where others did not, suggested a different path, one that led to the past, and it did not take long to find exactly what she suspected. Years ago, long before Oliver Graves had come into Sir Reginald's employment, another man had held the very same position, Albert Graves, Oliver's father. For over a decade, Albert Graves had been Sir Reginald's trusted assistant, a quiet man, diligent, reliable, unassuming, so much so that people barely noticed him, much like his son. Then one day, without warning, he was dismissed. The official reason, a financial discrepancy, a sum of money unaccounted for. The truth, however, was far more insidious. Sir Reginald, ever the proud and ruthless man, had accused Albert of theft. The accusation was swift, public, and utterly devastating. Though the sum was small, the damage was irreparable. Albert Graves had been cast out in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, his family left in ruin. A man like Sir Reginald had not cared about the consequences. He had not spared a thought for the loyal servant he had humiliated, the life he had shattered. He had played his music, attended his gatherings, and forgotten the name Albert Graves altogether. But Albert's son had not. Oliver Graves had not forgotten. He had grown up in the shadow of that disgrace, watching his father sink into despair, his family struggle to survive, all because of one man's careless cruelty. And so he had waited, patiently, carefully. He had positioned himself back inside Sir Reginald's life, earning his trust, biding his time, and when the moment was right, when Sir Reginald was old and set in his ways, when his habits had become unbreakable and predictable, Oliver had struck, not with a gun, not with a knife, but with something far more poetic. Sir Reginald had lived by his music, by his piano, and so he had died by it. Miss Marple closed her knitting bag with a quiet, satisfied snap. The stage was set, and soon the murderer would reveal himself. The final performance. The grand music room of Ashworth Manor had never felt so suffocating. Once a space of elegance and refinement, filled with the echoes of Sir Reginald's masterful performances, it now stood draped in a thick, invisible shroud of suspicion. The polished keys of the great piano, once caressed by the maestro's skilled hands, now seemed to hold a darker secret, their silent presence more ominous than any melody that had ever been played upon them. The suspects entered, one by one, each carrying the invisible burden of the crime. Lady Ashworth sat stiffly in a high-backed chair near the window, her delicate fingers gripping the edge of her silk scarf as if to steady herself. The candlelight flickered against her pale face, revealing the lines of resentment etched into her otherwise graceful features. Her mourning attire was impeccable, but there was no sorrow in her eyes, only a quiet, simmering bitterness. Henry Ashworth, the disinherited heir, stood near the fireplace, his fingers drumming impatiently against the marble mantel. His eyes, dark and restless, flickered toward the piano before darting away, unable to meet its lifeless form. Frustration radiated from him, the weight of lost fortune pressing upon his shoulders. Bernard Hale lingered near the bookshelves, his long fingers tracing the leather spines of forgotten compositions, though his mind was elsewhere. A man of talent and pride, reduced to the shadow of Sir Reginald's success. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his jaw tight. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, stood closest to the doorway, his nervous glances shifting between the gathered figures. His profession demanded a mask of composure, but sweat clung to his brow, his throat working as he swallowed hard. The secrets of a dead man often came at a cost, and he, perhaps more than anyone, knew the weight of what was hidden within Sir Reginald's final testament. And then there was Oliver Graves, the last to enter, silent, unassuming, his posture impeccable, his movements careful. There was no hesitation in his steps, no flicker of fear in his expression. He took his place near the piano, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his face unreadable. If he felt the noose tightening, he did not show it. Inspector Craik remained by the door, his arms crossed, his keen eyes scanning the room, but he said nothing. Not yet. This was Miss Marple's stage now. She sat, as she always did, with perfect poise, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her fingers, usually so steady, now remained still, clasped lightly over one another. She let the silence settle, let the weight of expectation grow thick in the air. The suspects exchanged glances, uncertain, restless, and then she spoke. Music, much like crime, is a matter of precision, she mused, her voice gentle, almost conversational. A single note out of place, a misstep in rhythm, and the entire performance is ruined. No one responded, but she did not need them to. Her gaze drifted to the piano. Sir Reginald was a man of habit, a musician who played with such exacting precision that every evening, at precisely 10 o'clock, he sat at this very instrument and played the same nocturne, striking the same keys with the same practiced confidence. Her eyes flickered to Oliver Graves. A man like that, so predictable in his ways, would never notice a trap set within the very thing he loved most. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Miss Marple reached into her pocket and produced a delicate lace handkerchief. With practiced grace, she stepped toward the piano, pressing it gently against one of the keys. A faint click echoed through the silence, a whisper of movement, and then there it was, a tiny sliver of metal, glinting in the candlelight, emerging from beneath the ivory key before retracting just as swiftly. A poisoned needle. Gasps filled the room. Henry recoiled. Lady Ashworth's hand flew to her throat. Bernard Hale muttered a curse under his breath. Oliver Graves did not move. Miss Marple turned, folding her hands once more. Murder, she continued, is an art form all its own. This was not an act of rage, nor was it a crime of simple greed. No. This, she gestured toward the hidden mechanism within the piano, was something far more deliberate, more patient, more personal. Her gaze locked onto Oliver's, and only one among us has proven himself a man of such remarkable patience. A heavy silence fell upon the room. All eyes turned toward the quiet secretary. Oliver remained perfectly still. He did not deny it, did not protest. Instead he offered Miss Marple a small knowing smile, a smile that sent a shiver down the spine of every person in the room, because in that moment, they all understood. He had never meant to get away with it. He had spent years watching, waiting, crafting the perfect execution. He had entered Sir Reginald's life, not as a servant, but as a sentence, a verdict long overdue, the son of a ruined man, returning to settle an old debt, and now the performance was over. Miss Marple exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Revenge, Mr. Graves," she said softly, "is a melody that lingers long after the final note has been played." Oliver tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then at last, he spoke. "It was a beautiful piece, wasn't it?" His voice was steady, the nocturne, and then he smiled, a slow, almost wistful smile, not of triumph, not of regret, but of a man who had finally finished a song that had played in his heart for far too long. The room remained deathly silent, as Inspector Craik stepped forward. It was over. The final note had been played. The last note. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She never needed to. With the same quiet precision that had solved countless mysteries before, she began. "It was a most unusual murder," she mused, letting her sharp blue eyes scan the room, lingering on each face just long enough to make them squirm. "Elegant in its own way, ingenious, and I dare say long in the making." She moved toward the grand piano, her fingertips grazing the polished keys without pressing them. The instrument, once the heart of Sir Reginald's world, now sat like a silent witness to his untimely end. Sir Reginald, as we all knew, was a man of habit. Every evening, at precisely the same time, he played this piano, and every evening he played the same nocturne, a piece so ingrained in his fingers that he no longer needed to glance at the keys. She paused, letting her words sink in, and someone here knew that. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled guests. Henry shifted uncomfortably by the fireplace. Lady Ashworth pressed a gloved hand to her throat. Bernard Hale's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. Even Mr. Weston, ever the composed solicitor, let his gaze dart nervously toward the door, but Oliver Graves remained perfectly still. Miss Marple continued, her tone steady but deliberate. The method was clever, devilishly so. A tiny spring-loaded needle, hidden beneath a single piano key, one that Sir Reginald struck with force every night, never thinking twice. A simple mechanism, quick and precise. The needle would emerge for only a fraction of a second, just long enough to pierce the skin. Such a small thing, so subtle, yet carrying a poison so lethal, that within moments Sir Reginald would have felt his body betray him. She turned slightly, her gaze flickering to the grand hall clock. And then there is this. All eyes followed hers. The heavy ornate clock on the wall stood frozen at exactly 1 o'clock, a deliberate deception, a forced alibi. The killer stopped the clock, fixing the time of death to ensure their whereabouts were beyond suspicion. A crime of patience, a crime of precision, and above all a crime committed by someone with access to this piano, someone Sir Reginald trusted implicitly. A deep silence filled the room. The weight of realization pressed down on them all. Then in the softest, most certain voice, Miss Marple spoke the name, Mr. Oliver Graves. No outburst followed, no sharp denial, no desperate protest. Oliver Graves simply regarded her with mild curiosity, his expression unreadable. And what leads you to that conclusion, Miss Marple? She smiled, almost kindly. The truth is, Oliver, you were never a suspect at first. You were too invisible. And that, you see, was your greatest strength. She stepped closer, her voice gentle but unyielding. You made yourself indispensable to Sir Reginald, just as your father once had. The quiet observer, the loyal secretary, the man no one ever looked at twice. For the first time something flickered in Oliver's eyes. Amusement. Miss Marple tilted her head. But when I discovered how Sir Reginald was killed, I realized something. She turned back toward the piano, resting her hand lightly on its surface. This was not a crime of greed, nor a moment of anger. No, this was something far colder. This was revenge. Another heavy silence fell, stretching unbearably. Then finally Oliver spoke. His voice was calm, unshaken, almost resigned. Revenge, Miss Marple. A soft chuckle escaped him. Such a dramatic word. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver, and yet entirely fitting. The room held its breath. Oliver exhaled, a slow measured sigh. Then ever so slightly, he smiled. It was over. The final note had been played. The last betrayal. The room held its breath. The ghost of the melody Sir Reginald had played every night still seemed to linger in the air, haunting the grand music hall of Ashworth Manor. The revelation had shattered the quiet elegance of the place, exposing the dark, tangled roots beneath its polished exterior. Oliver Graves had been led away, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridors, but the weight of his crime still pressed against the walls. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands neatly folded, her gaze steady as she observed the aftermath. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of calculation. In every corner of the room something shifted, not relief, not grief, but the quiet rearranging of ambitions and fears. Lady Ashworth was the first to break the silence. She exhaled slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress with an air of finality. There was no sadness in her expression, only a strange sort of release. For years Sir Reginald had ruled over this household with an iron will, his presence looming over them all. Now at last that weight was gone. "Well," she said briskly, adjusting the glittering bracelet on her wrist, "I suppose there will be matters to attend to. I shall leave the morning to those who feel inclined." Across the room Henry Ashworth did not bother with pretense. He had played the role of the dutiful son well enough, but now with his father gone, his real concerns surfaced. He straightened, fixing his gaze on Mr. Weston, the solicitor, and the will. He asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Too careful, Miss Marple, ever attuned to such subtleties, detected the unmistakable undercurrent of anticipation beneath his words. Mr. Weston hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. He had spent years handling Sir Reginald's affairs, and he knew all too well that the old man had relished control even in death. There would be surprises. There always were. The will remains as it was, he said, adjusting his cuffs. However, a single word and the air in the room thickened. However, the most dangerous word in such matters. Henry's posture tensed, but it was Lady Ashworth who spoke first. However, what, Mr. Weston? Her voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, a blade hidden beneath silk. Weston cleared his throat. There is an addendum, one Sir Reginald made a year ago, a stipulation regarding his estate. A year ago, the timing was not lost on Miss Marple. That would have been around the time Oliver Graves arrived. The timing was never a coincidence. What stipulation? Henry's voice had lost its neutrality. It was no longer careful, it was demanding. Weston hesitated only a moment before answering. That should Sir Reginald die under suspicious circumstances, certain assets would be placed in trust, indefinitely. The silence that followed was heavy. A different kind of weight now filled the room. Not grief, not relief, but something far sharper, betrayal. The Ashworths had expected wealth to fall into their waiting hands like ripe fruit. Instead it had slipped through their fingers. Lady Ashworth's expression remained composed, but her knuckles whitened against the fabric of her dress. Henry turned away sharply, jaw tight, hands curled into fists. Bernard Hale, who had remained silent through most of the evening, let out a dry chuckle from where he stood by the bookshelves. "Well played," he murmured. Miss Marple simply watched. There had been two crimes committed within these walls, one of revenge and one of greed, and while Oliver Graves had executed his plan with the patience of a man consumed by the past, the Ashworths had done so with the desperation of those who saw their future slipping away. In the end they had all lost. She rose gracefully, picking up her knitting once more. "A tune that never lies," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, because the truth, like music, could not be rewritten. It could only be heard if one knew how to listen. A symphony of silence. The will had never been signed. The words hung in the air, delicate but undeniable, shifting the tide of expectation in the room. Mr. Weston glanced at the gathered guests, his usually composed face betraying just a hint of discomfort. "The last executed version still stands," he admitted. A beat of silence followed, a moment stretched thin with unspoken calculations. Then, at last, Henry Ashworth exhaled. It was a quiet breath, but Miss Marple did not miss the subtle change in his posture. His shoulders, rigid all evening, relaxed just slightly. He had braced himself for loss, had prepared for the worst, and yet, fate, or perhaps negligence, had granted him the very fortune he had feared slipping away. Across the room, Bernard Hale chuckled, shaking his head as he poured himself another glass of brandy. The old man spent his life controlling everything, he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, always dictating, always ensuring the world bent to his will. He took a slow sip, savoring it, and yet, the one thing he didn't finalize is the only thing that matters now. There was a wry amusement in his tone, but also something else, a trace of satisfaction, perhaps even quiet contempt. Sir Reginald's iron grip had held them all captive in life, and yet, in death, he had unwittingly relinquished the very power he had so fiercely guarded. Miss Marple, who had been a silent observer through most of the conversation, finally rose from her chair. Unlike the others, she had no interest in the will or the practicalities that would follow. Money and power, such things held no mystery for her. No, her mind was elsewhere, drawn by a whisper of something unfinished, something unresolved. Her steps carried her back to the music room, to the grand piano that stood in the dim light, silent, unassuming, and yet a vessel of death as surely as any weapon. She approached it with quiet reverence, her fingers drifting lightly across the keys as if the instrument itself might whisper secrets. Without thinking, she pressed down, letting the familiar strains of Nocturne in E-flat major spill into the stillness. The melody unfurled, soft and delicate, a thing of beauty laced with sorrow. It was the very tune that had led Sir Reginald to his end. A moment later, footsteps approached. A shadow fell across the threshold. Inspector Kralik leaned against the doorframe, watching her with mild curiosity. "I didn't take you for a pianist, Miss Marple." She gave a small knowing smile, her fingers lingering on the keys before lifting them gracefully. "Oh, I wouldn't claim to be one," she admitted, "but music is rather like human nature, don't you think? Patterns, habits, repetitions, and sometimes, hidden notes, things only a careful listener will ever notice." Kralik folded his arms, a smirk playing at his lips. "You knew it was Oliver Graves from the start, didn't you?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not at first," she said, "but once I understood how Sir Reginald was killed, the rest fell into place. The patience, the skill, the knowledge to construct such a methodical trap, it all pointed to someone who had spent years preparing, and then, of course, there was his father's story." Kralik exhaled, shaking his head. "Revenge, a long time to wait for it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression distant, thoughtful. "Yes, but revenge, Inspector, is never quite as sweet as people imagine." She tapped a single key lightly, letting its solitary note ring out before fading into silence. "This piano never lied," she murmured. "It did precisely what it was meant to do." Her gaze shifted to Kralik, her blue eyes sharp yet kind. "But people always do." Kralik let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, it's all wrapped up now thanks to you." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug, as if solving a murder was no more troublesome than knitting a new pattern. "Oh, it was all there to be seen, Inspector," she said lightly. "One simply had to listen." She smoothed down her coat, casting a final glance at the piano, the instrument of music, of beauty, and of death. Then, with the same quiet grace with which she had arrived, she turned toward the door. "It's time I returned to St. Mary," she said cheerfully. "Murder is all very well, but I find a little gardening, and a quiet cup of tea far more satisfying." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering echoes of a tune that had never lied.